All right, welcome to our Bible study today. My name's Jason Anderson. I am the preacher at the Southern Hope Church of Christ in Falmouth, Kentucky. If you're joining us today and you're not part of the church, I'm just glad that you're here. If you're part of the church, this is our Wednesday night study right now as we just take a break from physically meeting during the winter month. I want to provide a little Bible study in the meantime. Today, we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 17. So if you got your Bibles, you go ahead and turn there. So why 1 Samuel chapter 17? We're actually going to study King David for a while. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be taking a look more in depth at David. Well, why David? Well, I often tell my students at the Bible college that I teach at Louisville Bible College that if you really want to understand the Old Testament, you really need to understand the importance of three individuals. The first individual is going to be Abraham, who is considered the father of the Jewish people. The second one would be Moses, who is the lawgiver. And then number three is going to be King David. David is of the priestly, or excuse me, the kingly tribe, and he is going to be the one whom Jesus comes through. So David is a very important person, but there's another reason I want to study it. One of the problems that we have sometimes in Christianity is we label some accounts as kid stories. These are books or these are accounts that we have in the Bible that we teach in Sunday school class, that we teach in children's church, that we teach at VBS, that we teach our kids because they're easy to remember. They're important events, and they do help us build uh, an understanding of the New Testament over, or the Bible, I should say, all over. However, one of the downfalls of doing this is that we no longer go back and look at them. We think that we have learned them since we learned them as a kid. We don't study them in depth. Sometimes we still study them like we did when we were a kid. And we miss out on many important lessons. I feel David is like this, not just the account we're reading today, but really his entire life. When you study David's life, he is a man that is called a man after God's own heart. And there are so many things that David does that we should mimic, that we should follow in his example, but we often don't see it because we don't study him the way it was intended. We study them from a kid's Sunday school VBS mentality. So I want to actually take a look at one of the events that a lot of adults think they understand, and that is David versus Goliath. And I want us to look at this event all over again, but I want us to do it more in depth. So we may not get finished with this lesson today. I don't intend to do that. I intend to break it up into a couple of different lessons. But I hope that you will just learn to view this in a totally different way. So as we're going to look, we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 17. David has already been brought into the book of 1 Samuel. At this time, a little background is that Israel has their first king, who is King Saul. But the problem with Saul is Saul was not faithful to the Lord like David would be. And Saul made a lot of mistakes. Because of these mistakes, he's going to lose his throne. And God is going to install David in there. Now, before you could just install David in there, David was not of a major family or anything to that nature. You kind of had to bring him on the scene. So God is going to introduce David to all of Israel. And he is going to use one of Israel's enemies to do this, the Philistines. Now, if you study the book of Judges and you study 1st and 2nd Samuel, you're going to see that one of the major people groups that Israel deals with is a group called the Philistines. They are constantly at war with one another. They are constantly battling one another over that land and other issues. And there would be times that God would allow the Philistines to win to punish Israel. There would be times that God would come to Israel's aid and rescue them from the Philistines. When we look at this lesson today, this is one of the events that's happening. Israel's major enemy, the Philistines, have come back and we're ready for another set of war. But there's a problem this time. The Philistines have what they think is a great advantage with one of their warriors. One of the more famous people of the Bible, but sometimes people don't really fully read his account. So we're going to do that. We're going to pick up with 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting with verse 4. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet tall, 9 inches, and he wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There was bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze javelin was slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formation, "Why do you come out line up in battle formation?" He asked them. "Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down here against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "I defile the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other." When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. So, as we're looking at this account, it's important to start to understand who this Philistine is. The Philistines worshipped false gods. They worshipped idols, and this is often what was the problem here between them and Israel. And when they weren't fighting each other, a lot of times the idols of the other surrounding nations would entice Israel to worship, and this is what would get them in trouble with God. So here comes this Philistine, and he's Goliath. Now, I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible. Different translations may talk about his height in a different way. The Christian Standard Bible tries to translate it in a way that helps us understand how tall he is. He's a 9 foot individual, and a lot of people will read that and think that this is bogus or anything like this. Well, modern science does tell us that there are diseases that cause people to have this incredible growth. I grew up a pro wrestling fan. Andre the Giant was one of them. Andre the Giant had a disease that caused his body to keep growing. The problem was his heart stayed the same size, and that's ultimately what killed him, was that his heart just could not take the growth of his body anymore. And they said of Andre the Giant, even though I know wrestling is fixed, I'm sorry to break that to you, but even though wrestling is fixed, they talked about how incredibly strong he was. So strong that when he wrestled Hulk Hogan being, depending on who you believe, between 6'5", 6'7", around 300 pounds, arms that measured over 20 inches. He claimed 24 inches. They said if Andre didn't want to lose to him, there's nothing Hogan could have done. Andre just would have easily overpowered him. Well, it would appear that that's what we're looking at here with this Philistine. Somebody that had a very similar disease, and we've seen people who, even in modern history, get over 8 foot tall and even further than that because of this disease. And then the Bible keeps emphasizing just how big he was. He wasn't just tall, but when it describes his armor and it describes everything that he takes to battle with him, he is a massive man. So the Philistines have this idea. You know, in their mind, it's not a bad strategy. We've got this one guy, we don't think anybody could take him one on one. So instead of all of us fighting in all this bloodshed, which if you look in the Bible, hundreds, sometimes even thousands of people die in these battles, we'll just have a one on one. And whoever wins, wins. So the challenge has now gone out to Israel. First of all, when you have a war, everybody's paying attention. Now you've got this other incentive here. You've got this massive man who is coming that's got everybody's attention again. God is going to use this event. See, the enemies of God doesn't always understand that they can unwillingly be a part of his plan. Sometimes God does allow certain individuals to rise up who are wicked and evil individuals to fulfill an ultimate purpose for him. An example of this would be if you go back into the book of Exodus and you look at Pharaoh. Pharaoh was one of those. The Pharaoh that faced Moses was raised up for that moment because he was arrogant, because he would defy God, and God would allow him to do these miracles to show the world that there was one true God. In this instance, this Philistine, Goliath, had no clue that he was allowed to do this, that he was allowed to come into this challenge, that he was allowed to make this challenge in order to raise up David, who is going to be the next king, who is going to be a prophet of God, who is going to be used to help bring in the Savior of the world. When God is ready to use somebody, he knows how to introduce them. At this point, nobody has any idea who David is. In fact, he's not even being mentioned at this point in the chapter. You know who is? Saul. So why is Saul being mentioned here? Well, if you go back in a couple of chapters, you will see that Saul was actually described as being a man who was a head taller than anyone else in Israel. One of the reasons the Israelites were so glad to have Saul come and compete as king and rule over them was because of his physical stature. He looked like a king. He looked like somebody you wanted to follow into battle. He looked the part. And that's all Israel at this point had cared about was somebody who looked right. Well, now we have somebody who's bigger and taller than Saul. And of course, Saul's got some age on him as well, but it's the king's duty to rally the troops. Saul's not stepping up to battle. In fact, one of the things to note is that Saul and all Israel, when they heard this is in verse 11, if you want to go back and look at this. When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Many of you listening say, well, yeah, but that's natural. And it is. Okay, so let's go back and look this. If somebody of this size and magnitude, this experienced warrior, was standing across from us, the natural reaction is fear. But that's the problem. We're talking about a natural reaction. When we're looking at the scripture and when we're looking at God and we're looking at the power of God, it's not supposed to be the natural reaction. We're supposed to listen to faith. You see, you get these two voices that are competing in your ear. You get faith versus fear. Fear will tell you what a mistake this is. Fear will tell you you're going to be defeated. Fear will tell you you're going to lose. Faith will tell you got to trust in God. You see, when he comes out, he's not really just challenging Israel. Later on, when we get to it, we're going to see where he is challenging David. He's not just challenging David, he's challenging God. When the enemies of God, whether it would be the enemies of the church, whether it would be people who are just trying to talk to you out of faith, when people are just trying to persuade you out of faith, whoever they are, when they're doing this, they are really trying to pull you away. You have to listen to faith. Now, he doesn't just have a physical advantage. He's got a technological advantage too. The blacksmiths at this time were located in Philistine territory, which means, and they also used iron to their advantage. He had a massive amount of armor. He had a massive amount of weaponry with him. It wasn't just looking at this guy and saying, look how big he is. It's looking at him and saying, he's got the warfare, he's got the technology, he's got the weaponry, he's got everything we don't. Once again, this is where fear comes in. I don't have what they have. Faith has to step in. And when you understand that somebody is challenging the church, when you understand that somebody is challenging God, when you understand that somebody is challenging Jesus Christ himself, you're not the one that they're fighting. They're fighting God. You have to have that courage that we're going to see out of David. But right now they don't. And all of Israel is terrified. Now, this is where we're going to start bringing in David. David is going to come in a little bit later because his father's going to send him down. So we're going to skip a little bit because this chapter is very long. Now, I want to get to at least part of David today in this lesson. So let's go into verse 23. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words. which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified. Stop right here. Israel really didn't always have a standing army like we would think about. However, they had men who were experienced in war. They had trained warriors. They had people who fought the Philistines before. When we're reading about these men who are leaving, terrified, retreating, terrified in the sight of David, by the way, this is important to remember. David is not watching just an average person leaving, he is watching experienced warriors. Now, this is something is essential. David had not seen war at this point. I'm not a soldier, I've never been a soldier. Maybe some of you who are listening to this and watching this have been soldiers. You actually know what war is like. For people like me who's never seen war, we don't always understand what it's like. When these guys were at the battle line, they knew what warfare looked like. They knew what war looked like. They knew what men like Goliath would do. They may not have seen Goliath per se in battle, but they have seen what big men have done. You know, you might be thinking here too, the Philistines, why are they acting so confident? A few generations before this, there was a man named Samson that fought on the side of Israel that brought terror to the people. This is their version of it. The only problem is Samson had God, Goliath had useless idols. But, anyways, let's get back into the account here. Previously, an Israelite man had declared, "Do you see this man who keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will make the man who kills him very rich and will give him his daughter. The king will also make his family of that man's father exempt from paying taxes in Israel." So David's here hearing this for the first time. There's this incentive because Saul doesn't want to go fight Goliath. So he's going to make him exempt for taxes. Hey, none of us like taxes. He's going to give him his daughter, which now gives you access to the king and brings you into the royal family. And he's going to give him a great reward. Everything that David is hearing is telling him that this is something that he should be involved in. So David's going to step into this. David spoke to the man who were standing with him. What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The troops told him about the offer, including, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. David's older brother Eliab listened as he spoke to the men. He became angry with him. "Why did you come down from here?" he asked. "Why did you leave these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down here to see the battle." "What have I done?" protested David. "It was just a question." Then he turned from those beside him to others in front of him and asked about the offer. The people gave him the same answer as before. Now, I want you to look at this. One of the things that I think we sometimes forget about David is looking at the pre-battle. A lot of times we really don't pay attention to the things that's happening until he starts picking up the rocks and he goes to the battle line. There's a lot here before you get there. I want you to understand the discouragement that is being placed into David's eyes, ears, mind, and heart. First of all, we already talked about it, but I want to mention it again. He saw all these men terrified to fight the battle. In other words, David sees this Goliath, so he sees this monstrous man. He's intimidated everybody. With him, he has this extra intimidation. All of his heroes who should have been stepping up to the battle, Saul, the king, the generals, even his older brothers, none of them would step up to the plate. In other words, he is seeing this discouragement that his heroes, I want you to think about this. You have heroes in the faith, whether they're heroes of the faith of history, whether they're people who are maybe have a spotlight on them, like a singer or a preacher, or maybe it's somebody in your local congregation and church. And I want you to imagine when it's time for somebody to stand up for the Lord, these people aren't doing it. The discouragement that you're going to feel in the heart and in the mind. This is a point we should not just overlook. David is seeing godly men and godly warriors run for cover. The second discouragement he's going to face is his brother. Now, previous to this, Samuel, whom the book is named after, came to anoint David. And when he did, they had brought all the brothers before him, and Samuel kept saying, "The Lord's not chosen this one." Meaning, David's brother, Eliab, who we're looking at here, was not chosen by Samuel. Who was? The youngest, who was out in the field. This is a very reminiscent, if you go back into the book of Genesis, of how Joseph was picked. Joseph was picked to go into Egypt to rescue the Israelites. His brothers were jealous over it. I believe there's some kind of jealousy here because Eliab knows that David has been picked by God to go and rule in Israel. He knows he is picked by God to go do something special. But instead of encouraging David or even being concerned about his welfare, hey, David, we know what you're going to be. Maybe this is not the safest place for you. Hey, David, you stick with me. Let me protect you because God's hand is upon you. Hey, David, have you prayed about this to be sure that this is where God wants you to be? He doesn't do any of this. He first of all accuses him falsely. You're here because of an evil heart. He accuses him to be derelict of his duty. Where's those sheep? Right now, the sheep of Israel should be David's concern, not the sheep out in the field. Eliab, he doesn't care about that. He is upset. So he tells him, "Why are you here?" So he accuses him of this arrogance. He accuses him of coming down seeing blood loss. But I want you to notice, David doesn't let that discourage you. I want you to understand that when you are being set apart from God to do something, when God wants you to do something, it's not just going to be everybody encouraging you and saying, "Yeah, go do this." You're going to have people that are going to tell you it can't be done. You can't defeat this giant. You can have people like Eliab and say, "You're here for all the wrong reasons." You're going to have people discourage you. If you know what you're doing is the will of God, you've got to move forward just like David was moving forward here. You cannot let the voice of discouragement stop you. And unfortunately, this is not the last voice of discouragement that David would hear before he went to fight Goliath. He's got another one. Um, Starting there with verse 31. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, so he had David brought to him. David said to Saul, "Don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go out and fight this Philistine." I love David's just bravery here. Saul replied, "You can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth. He's been a warrior since his youth." David answered, "Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. It reared up against me. I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." Then David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." We're going to look in a separate lesson more of David's faith and how he actually did this. I want to look again at this discouragement aspect. When David comes, now remember, nobody else is taking up Saul on his altar. Nobody in the kingdom. His generals, his brave warriors, David's brothers, they've all heard the same challenge. They all had the same opportunity. None of them would take this up because none of them believed it could be done. David has the faith to do this. And I want you to understand, it is faith at this point. Saul directly comes and tells him, "You can't do it." Let's remember who Saul is. Saul's the king. Saul is the highest official in Israel. He should even though he's not here, he should have been representing God, even though he wasn't, because Saul had just started falling away from God and away from God and away from God. Now, I want you to imagine that the person who is of the highest authority looks you in the eye and says, "You can't do it." David had every opportunity to allow fear to get into his head. Fear freezes you. Everybody else in this account was frozen in fear. They couldn't think, they couldn't react, they couldn't do anything but cower and hide. And by the way, what good was that going to do? The intimidation, even if this battle with Goliath hadn't happened, the Philistines had won a psychological war here because they listened to fear. And the people who were afraid of fear, instead of encouraging David, instead of putting him forward and saying, "Yeah, God can do this. We've been waiting for a guy just like you." Satan is in their ear, repeating that fear and trying to discourage David. This is the moment that God had set for David. You can do this. You can go forward. You can win this battle. Just couldn't listen to fear. The first real lesson I want you to understand as we're looking at David is not to listen to fear. You know, fear is something Satan uses to quench your faith. Fear is something Satan uses to get you to leave the faith. But the thing about fear is it only has power if you allow it. In other words, if you're not listening to fear, if you fight against fear, if you do not give into fear, it has no power. And when God is with you on your side here, which is what David understood at a very young age, by the way, David is a teenager here. The reason David is not initially on the battle lines is because he was too young and he was the youngest son to go out to battle. So he is probably, I know a lot of times, again, do not think about the children's book version of this where you see like what looks like a little 9 or 10 year old. David is a young adult, probably somewhere around 16, maybe up to 18 years old, probably under 18. Just he's an older person who is able to watch the sheep and to fight off a bear and a lion, which we'll talk about more next time. So this is not a little boy. This is a grown teenager to young man, and he has more faith right now than the adults. And he's not listening to fear. If God is calling you into service today, Satan is going to put fear into your ears. Satan is going to tell you you can't do it. One of the most amazing things I ever saw in my life was how Louisville Bible College came back. When Louisville Bible College was practically dead about 10 years ago, people said it could not come back. That was fear. People motivated by faith said, no, God can resurrect the dead. And the school today is strong, is moving forward, is taking on new students, graduating students, putting people out into the field. Because you can't be motivated by fear. It's not over until you give up. And since David wasn't giving up, he had an opportunity. When God calls you into his service, do not listen to fear. Listen to faith. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how David developed this faith. Because developing fear is easy. It's listening to everybody else. It's looking at the wrong things. It's allowing doubt into your life. Anybody can develop fear. What we want to look at is how did he develop the faith to defeat this giant? And the reason we want to do that is because we're all going to face a version of Goliath in our lives, and we have to have the faith to overcome him. So if you want to know how to do that, we're going to drop another lesson next week, probably Wednesday night. whether you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it happens to be. You just join back here, same place. We'll pick it up next week. If you have questions, wherever yet, put it into the comments. I'll try to address them in the next lesson. Thanks for listening. Please like and share it, and please help us to spread the word. Thanks a lot. See you then.